75% of the zombies were cured, but life in society was scarier than they ever imagined. In the near future, all of Europe is swept by the maize virus, a disease that causes extreme psychosis in the infected, turning them into ruthless zombies. While most of the continent manages to contain the outbreak, Ireland falls to the infection. However, scientists discover a cure for the horrifying disease. 75% of those infected are successfully treated, but they still remember everything they did as zombies. Now, the Irish government must decide what to do with the remaining 25%, known as the resistant, who are immune to the cure. Meanwhile, the third wave of the cured prepares to leave the rehabilitation center and re-enter society. One of the cured, Senan, is haunted by terrifying nightmares where he repeatedly transforms back into a mindless zombie. Jolted awake, he rushes to the mirror, checking his eyes to make sure he's still cured, that the infection hasn't returned. His friend Connor, who went through treatment with him, approaches as Senan struggles to shake off the horrific memories. Senan fears that society will never accept them, but Connor insists that everything will go back to normal. Later, Senan meets with rehabilitation officer Sergeant Cantor. Before releasing him, Cantor asks about his condition. Senan reassures him that despite being infected for 4 years and still suffering from nightmares, his violent urges have completely faded. Cantor tells him that nightmares are a good thing. They'll remind him of the suffering he caused, ensuring he never breaks the law again. He also informs Senan that his late brother's wife, Abby, has agreed to take him in. The news shocks Senan. Most healthy people fear and despise the cured, believing they're still dangerous. Finally, the third wave of the cured is released from the hospital. Most have no homes to return to, so they're taken by bus to a housing facility. Outside, a furious mob of protesters demands their isolation, calling them criminals. Senan and Connor say their goodbyes. Since Connor must remain at the center, he warns Senan not to reveal his secret to Abby. Meanwhile, protests erupt across the city. Activists argue that the first 2 waves of the cured failed to reintegrate, and all former zombies should either be locked away or eliminated. Abby, a reporter, interviews a government official who is also skeptical about the cured returning to society. During the outbreak, Abby lost her husband, Luke, and now raises their young son, Killian, alone. Despite her loss, she sympathizes with the cured and doesn't see them as a threat. When Senan arrives at her home, it's clear he's uneasy accepting her help, but Abby hugs him, assuring him that Luke would have done the same. She hesitantly asks if Senan was there when Luke died. He replies that he wasn't allowed to be with him. That night, Senan is overwhelmed by panic, unable to sleep. He remembers how, at the start of the outbreak, with sirens blaring, he and Luke were desperately trying to find a safe place. But right in their home, a zombie attacks Senan. Luke immediately strikes the zombie in the head, but not before it manages to bite and infect his brother. In agony, Senan tells Luke to get as far away as possible. Luke locks himself in a room, but soon the virus takes hold of Senan, and he begins furiously pounding on the door, trying to break in and reach Luke. The next day, Connor arrives at his father's place. He explains he's now working as a janitor and asks his father to help him get back to the courthouse, where he worked before the outbreak, but his father refuses to even speak to him because of what he did to his mother when he was a zombie. Meanwhile, Senan grabs a bike and heads to the rehab center where he works as an orderly. At the checkpoint, an officer checks his eyes to make sure he's healthy. Senan enters the ward where a resistant named Joe is lying in a bed behind a partition. He approaches her, but she doesn't react. However, as soon as Dr. Joan walks in, Joe suddenly starts screaming, trying to break free and attack her. Senan holds her down while Joan gives Joe a sedative shot, surprised that the resistant doesn't try to harm him. Dr. Joan explains that zombies still view the cured as one of their own because traces of the virus linger in their cells, even after they've recovered. Joan is working tirelessly to create a viable vaccine for the resistant. While Senan is bathing Joe, Joan receives some grim news. The Irish government has decided to start eliminating the resistant, as curing them is almost impossible. Meanwhile, Abby picks Killian up from school. Other parents scold her for taking in a cured, refusing to let their children interact with Killian. Soon after, Senan visits Connor at the shelter, where the resistant are upset about the hostile treatment from healthy people. Senan explains that the resistant don't attack the cured because they see them as zombies, just like themselves. This gives Connor an idea that the cured would be safer and more at home with the resistant than with healthy people. Just then, Sergeant Cantor interrupts them. He orders Senan to leave and reprimands Connor for not showing up to work. Connor insists he's not a janitor, but Cantor laughs and reminds him that it's now up to him to decide how the cured live. The sergeant also demands that Connor stop bothering his family, because they no longer need him. Those words set Connor off, and he charges at Cantor. Senan tries to help his friend, but the military won't let him get close. The cured's hatred for the healthy grows stronger. That night, Senan has another horrifying dream, where he, as a zombie, attacks Killian. The next morning, Senan finds graffiti on the front door, marking the homes of the cured, a message from the activists. But Abby insists that it's not the worst thing they could have done. Meanwhile, the government has already begun the humane euthanasia of the resistant, which is expected to be completed by the end of the week. Abby heads to work, and on her way, Connor catches up with her. He has been watching Senan and his much happier life from afar. Deciding to introduce himself, Connor is surprised to find that Abby is friendly toward him, unlike the others. He explains that he used to be a lawyer, but now, working as a janitor, it's the best he can do. Abby asks what it's like to be a zombie, and Connor shares that it felt like being trapped inside his own body, constantly battling with himself. Meanwhile, Senan continues helping Joan with the resistant. During a break, he notices two soldiers entering a hospital building and decides to follow them. Soon, Senan discovers one soldier holding a woman zombie while the other urinates on her. In a fit of rage, Senan charges at the second soldier, but he's quickly slammed against the wall. The soldier holding the resistant is distracted, and the woman breaks free, starting to chase him. The second soldier releases Senan, draws his weapon, and shoots the zombie. Shaken, Senan stares at the woman he shot, and as the soldiers leave, they remark that they will all lose their lives in the coming days anyway. Riots continue in the streets. Joan is fighting for justice for the resistant and appears on a news program. The host claims that as long as the resistant are alive, there is a risk of a new epidemic. Joan insists that she will find a cure for them, but she needs more time and resources. The host counters that resources are needed for the healthy population, but Joan argues that this is no reason to get rid of 5,000 people. The cured in the shelter are also watching the program. Connor is convinced that former zombies must fight for their rights. He tells Senan that the government won't stop with the elimination of the resistant and will soon come for them, so they need to stop them at any cost. Connor leads Senan to the basement of the shelter, where members of the so-called Cured Alliance have prepared several bombs and Molotov cocktails. Connor reassures Senan that they plan to burn only abandoned houses, and no one will be hurt. Senan decides to join the protest, and as a result, the rebels set fire to 5 houses in one night. Meanwhile, Abby's boss wakes her with a call and orders her to prepare a report about the incident. She wants to tell Senan everything, but when she looks around, she realizes he's not home. The next morning, Senan learns that the attack has left several people injured and one dead. The Cured Alliance has claimed responsibility, and now the government considers it a terrorist organization. The police arrest all the activists fighting for the rights of the cured. Senan is tormented by guilt. He tries to collect himself in front of the mirror, but his mind is flooded with memories. In a flashback, it's revealed that at the start of the outbreak, Connor was the one who bit Senan. Despite everything, Senan managed to break down the door to the room where Luke was hiding. And although his brother tried to reason with him and begged him to stop, under Connor's influence, Senan still attacked Luke and took his life. Meanwhile, the Cured Alliance refuses to surrender and is preparing new acts of terrorism. Senan heads to work at the hospital and, in Joan's office, accidentally discovers a photo of Joan with Joe. It's clear they were close, which explains Joan's desire to save the resistant. When Senan returns home, Abby asks if he is a member of the Cured Alliance. He denies it, explaining his late-night absences by saying he doesn't want to disturb her and Killian. Abby seems to doubt his words. She shares her painful memories of the epidemic. She was only able to return to the city 2 years later, when rumors of a cure began to spread. Abby had hoped that Luke was among the infected and would be saved, but when she came home, she found his body. She can't hold back her tears as she recalls the loss of her husband, reminding Senan that they are family, and he shouldn't hide anything from her. To distract Abby from the painful memories, Senan takes her and Killian out of town. As they admire the beautiful view, Senan picks up his nephew and shares that he and Luke used to come here often. That evening, they return home, and at dinner, Senan plays with Killian while Abby watches them with a smile. Soon, Connor stops by, and Abby invites him to the table. The conversation quickly turns to the actions of the Cured Alliance. Connor and Senan explain that a cure for the resistant will be found soon, and the government cannot be allowed to take their lives. However, Abby, who continues to support the cured, argues for euthanasia, as even one escaped resistant could spark a new epidemic. Connor tries to argue with Abby, but Senan hints that it's time for Connor to leave. Before leaving, Connor asks if she could forgive the person who took her husband's life. Upset, Abby insists that the infected are not to blame because they couldn't control themselves due to the virus, then leaves the room. Left alone with Connor, Senan accuses him of lying about the bombing.
There's always casualties, Senan.
Connor claims that the cured are suffering as well, but Senan responds by saying he's leaving the Cured Alliance and wants to focus more on his family. Before walking away, Connor calls him a coward and warns that Abby will eventually discover the truth about her husband's death. The next morning, Senan rides Killian to school on his bike. Meanwhile, Abby rushes to get ready for work when she's unexpectedly visited by Sergeant Cantor. He insists that they need to meet with the families of the cured to check on their well-being. Abby reassures him that Senan is fine, criticizing him for his harsh treatment of the cured at the facility. But Cantor counters, explaining that zombies aren't as mindless and powerless as people believe. The infected can form packs and plan targeted attacks on specific victims, establishing an inexplicable mental connection between them. Cantor hands Abby a folder with confidential documents and asks her to report any unusual behavior from Senan. Inside the folder, Abby finds a photo of Senan and Connor from when they were zombies, even though Senan had claimed they met after their rehabilitation. Later, Abby grabs a camera and heads to the facility. As she's exploring the hallways, she notices a group of 5 cured individuals. Standing in a circle, they breathe in unison with their eyes closed, seemingly creating the same connection Connor described. As Abby moves on, one of the cured spots her. On another floor, she discovers Connor addressing the Cured Alliance members. She decides to secretly record a short clip of their meeting but is interrupted by the same woman. Connor also spots Abby. Cantor's words have clearly impacted her view of the Cured, and she now accuses Connor and his associates of being a gang of criminals. She blames him for orchestrating terrorist attacks and demands that he and Senan stay away from them. Abby heads toward the exit, but several Cured begin to chase her, trying to grab her camera. Fortunately, she manages to fend off the crazed Cured and escapes through a window. Meanwhile, the military continues to eliminate the resistant. Joan is monitoring the remaining patients through security cameras and notices that Joe suddenly rises and sits up, almost like a normal person. Excited, Joan visits her friend, hopeful that she's finally improving. But as soon as Joan touches Joe, she's attacked. Joan manages to pull back since Joe's leg is still strapped to the bed. The soldiers rush in at the sound of the commotion and take Joe away for euthanasia. Joan tearfully begs them not to, insisting she'll save Joe, but the soldiers ignore her. That evening, Abby reviews the footage she captured and suddenly notices the word scum written on the window. She immediately rushes outside, but finds no one there. However, shortly after, a stranger bursts into the house with a bat and strikes Senan in the head. Senan loses consciousness, and memories of Luke's death flash before his eyes once again. The next morning, the police inspect several similar messages around the house and question Senan about the attacker, but he can't remember anything. The officer warns him that incidents like this are common in the homes of the Cured, and they're unlikely to find the perpetrator. Senan realizes that society will never accept him. He meets with Connor and decides to return to the Cured Alliance. Meanwhile, Abby discovers that the memory card with the footage from the facility has gone missing from her camera. She calls Connor and asks him to keep an eye on Connor, who seems to be planning another terrorist attack. Senan attends a Cured Alliance meeting and is shocked to find Joan there, who, it turns out, was invited by Connor. Joan is determined to save Joe at any cost, while Connor plans to use zombies to blackmail the government. Senan fears that Joe's release could result in casualties, but no one in the Cured Alliance seems concerned. Suddenly, special forces burst into the building. Connor and other members of the Cured Alliance manage to escape, but Senan decides not to resist and allows himself to be arrested. Cantor interrogates Senan, asking about Connor's plans. Senan doesn't want to betray his friend, but Cantor reminds him that it was Connor who infected him and that Connor no longer cares about him. Cantor also offers to protect Senan's family in exchange for information, but Senan remains silent. Meanwhile, Connor finds Abby at a playground. He shows her the scar on his neck left by Luke and tells her that it was Senan who took his life. Soon, Senan is released, and a member of the Cured Alliance gives him information from Connor about their next meeting. Senan returns home, and a distraught Abby demands that he tell her the truth about Luke's death. Senan admits that he was the one who took Luke's life, and Abby, enraged, kicks him out of the house. That evening, Senan goes to the meeting with Connor. Connor says he told Abby the truth so that Senan would understand that no one among the healthy people understands them. Senan asks if Connor ever has nightmares, and to his surprise, he realizes that Connor doesn't. Suddenly, they're interrupted by Sergeant Cantor. He threatens them with a weapon and prepares to arrest them, accusing Connor of planning the first terrorist attack. Senan cooperates and puts on the handcuffs himself, but Connor refuses to give up. He grabs a knife and attacks Cantor, delivering several blows to his neck. Connor grabs his gun and points it at Senan, accusing him of betrayal. Senan declares that he won't let him commit another crime. However, Connor insists that everything is already said and runs off, hearing the wail of sirens in the distance. The next day, members of the Cured Alliance, disguised as medical staff, sneak onto the hospital grounds and brutally deal with the guards. They then make their way to the control room. Joan enters her password to open the door to Joe's cell and release her, but the Cured Alliance has other plans. One of the Cured points a gun at a shocked Joan and releases all of the remaining resistant. Meanwhile, Senan arrives at the hospital, now filled with the resistant, followed by more military forces trying to prevent the virus from spreading. As explosions and gunfire ring out, the resistant rush out into the streets. When the hallways clear, Senan notices that Joe isn't leaving and remains seated in her cell. Joan notices this as well. She immediately rushes to her friend and finds that Joe has, indeed, gotten better. Joan takes her hand and kisses her, but suddenly one of the resistant attacks her. Meanwhile, Abby hears a terrifying growl from outside. Grabbing an axe, she rushes into the street, where she ends the life of one of the resistant. Soon, a military truck pulls up, and soldiers begin evacuating the local residents. Abby protests, insisting that she needs to pick up her son from school, but the soldiers refuse to let her go. Suddenly, she spots Senan running ahead of a crowd of zombies and pleads with him to find Killian. The soldiers continue to shoot at the freed zombies, but the undead turn on the healthy people, and the number of infected grows rapidly. Jo lies beside Joan's body for a while before she eventually heads outside. Senan reaches the school and retrieves Killian, but soon they're being chased by Connor and several zombies. Senan tells Killian to run while he tries to distract their pursuers. He fights off zombies, but suddenly Connor hits him over the head with a pipe. Enraged by Senan's betrayal, Connor intensifies the beating. Thankfully, a soldier appears just in time and shoots Connor. Senan manages to escape and find Killian, but despite his serious injuries, Connor survives and disappears into the unknown. Meanwhile, Abby flees the camp. After shooting 2 zombies, she makes her way back home. Soon, she reunites with Senan and Killian, but just as they are about to embrace, a hidden resistant attacks the boy. Senan manages to kill the attacker, but not before the resistant manages to bite Killian's arm. Abby, horrified, realizes that it's the end, and is about to shoot her son, but Senan reassures her, saying he can still help him because, after all, Joan managed to find a cure. Senan picks up Killian and leaves, while Abby is left behind, sobbing in grief and despair. A short time later, the news reports that, despite a new outbreak of the virus in Ireland, the situation is once again under control. However, the government now faces the task of dealing with 8,000 infected individuals. Meanwhile, the Cured Alliance continues to expand, and Connor continues his fight for the rights of the cured. One day, the radio announces that infected groups have been found in the western part of the country, managing to evade the military. Upon hearing this, Abby smiles through her tears, hoping that her son will survive. Fortunately, Senan and Killian are part of one of these groups and continue to fight for their lives. What's your opinion? Do violent criminals deserve a second chance to reintegrate into society, or are they beyond redemption and change? Share your thoughts in the comments down below, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one.